The information provided in this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice. We are not financial advisors, and nothing discussed on this podcast should be considered a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold any security. All opinions expressed are those of the hosts and guests and are subject to change without notice. Listeners should do their own research and consult with a qualified financial advisor before making any investment decisions. Investing involves risk, including the potential loss of principal. Past performance is not indicative of future results. All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Value Seville podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Hendrickson, and this is part one of our interview with Calgary Leveen of Anhinga Investment Partners. And in this interview, Calgary tells us about his latest investment idea, which is a special situation investment in a company called NextNav, a very interesting special sit, one that's timely given that the company has potential catalysts on the near horizon. It was an interview we very much enjoyed doing. Complicated investment, but as I said, one that's a hell of a lot of fun to talk about. Just to let you guys know, at the time of this recording, neither Donnie nor myself had any position in NextNav. Calgary obviously does, which is why he's here to talk about it. So please sit back and relax and enjoy part one of our interview with Calgary Leveen. All right. Welcome, everybody, to the Value Seville podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Hendrickson, here with my co-host, Donnie Sitar, and our today Value Seville attendee and a longtime friend of mine, Calgary Leveen from Anhinga Capital Management. And if you're sitting there wondering, Anhinga, what is that? You know, Calgary can tell you more about it, but my understanding is it's a bird that goes underwater where lots of other birds do not go and gets to eat little fish and eels that a lot of other birds miss. And this is kind of analogous to your investment philosophy. Tell us a little bit more about that, Calgary. Tell us about you, your philosophy, and Anhinga.
Sure. Thanks for the intro and thanks for having me. You did a good job, Jeff, of explaining the bird. It's a strange bird, but I picked it because you often see it sitting on a tree branch, drying its wings. It looks like lots of inactivity, but then it can spring into action. It can dive quickly and go after little things. Anhinga is my firm. It's a one-man shop in Brooklyn, New York, and I focus on smaller companies who are usually going through some sort of change that isn't reflected in the financial statements. Yeah, I'm just happy to be here today and to talk with the two of you.
Well, great. Well, I'll start us off. So Calgary is a member of our Value Seville community. He came to our event. It's been every year that we've had it, actually, but he was there this past May in Charlottesville, and he pitched a very interesting, I guess you can call it a special situation type of investment company called NextNav. And that is going to be what we are discussing today. The NextNav thesis is very fascinating to me because it's got multiple components. It's got catalysts. It takes a little work to understand all the parts, right? Like any good special sit, it's not something you can just figure out in 5 minutes. It's something that you need to think a lot about. You need to do a lot of reading. You need to understand the players, the motivations. There's political angles. There's all kind of interesting angles to this, but I will not give it justice since you are the expert here on it. So maybe kind of just walk us through NextNav, kind of high level to start. What drew you to the investment? Kind of what are the moving parts, the big thesis? I guess I could say almost as like if we're the PM and you're pitching us on this idea for the first time, what are the big things that we need to know? And what drew you to the company and to the stock?
Sure. So the company is NextNav. The ticker is NN. It's on the NASDAQ. NextNav is a positioning company with a spectrum asset attached. There's a well-advanced regulatory campaign going on presently before the FCC that, if successful, will mean a GPS backup for America, more spectrum for the carriers, and profits for NextNav stockholders. I believe that we should see a notice of proposed rulemaking before the end of this year. I expect the stock to be up 40% on that. And I think it's a double again from there within 18 months.
Okay, so let's kind of roll that back a bit, unpack it. You brought up a lot of things. PNT is a technology. You brought up backup, a terrestrial-based backup to our current GPS system in the country. You talked about spectrum. And I guess if we wanted to kind of come maybe 20,000 feet, kind of walk us through all of these components, what NextNav is trying to achieve, what they're asking for, what the potential outcomes of that could be, both for the country in terms of this backup to GPS, terrestrial-based backup, why we need it, and then what would be, the
the benefits to NextNav shareholders if all this is approved? And also, you mentioned like the proposal for rulemaking, the NPRN. What is that? Kind of walk us through all these components so the listeners can kind of get an idea of everything you're talking about.
Sure. There's basically two regulatory actions that are going on in parallel, and I'll get to that in a second. But just, I think an important part of the story is also why now. I've been in this stock for 2 years, and you might look at the chart and say, oh, well, I missed that one. You haven't. I think that it's probably the most interesting risk reward that it's been in the last 2 years. And so I think it is worthy of study for people who are willing to do the work. And as a disclosure, I own the stock. I own a lot of the stock. It's important to me. But do your own work. This isn't advice. I'm not a fiduciary. Effectively, I think that the odds have increased a lot, and the value of Spectrum has also increased since I've been in it, and that's why I think it's worth studying now. To understand the story, you need to understand two regulatory processes that are going on, two dockets effectively on the FCC website. I'll provide links to you so you can put them in the show notes.
Okay.
The first is NextNav's petition. Right, NextNav in April of 2024 to the FCC, and they went forward with an ask, a pretty bold ask, but one that would potentially provide a GPS backup to the entire country at no cost to taxpayers. So presently, the request is about new rules for the lower 900 band. So the 900 band goes from 902 megahertz to 28. That's what they're talking about. NextNav is presently the largest licensee in that band. And the band is split up between licensed and unlicensed users. NextNav, like I said, is the largest licensee. They're proposing that they swap their licenses for a 15 megahertz nationwide band. Also in this band are toll operators. So think about Easy Pass. They are licensed, but at site-specific locations. And then you have a large community of unlicensed users, right? Those are called Part 15 in the FCC language, but those can be many of your household devices, right? Alarm systems, remote controls, baby monitors, a whole host of things. So NextNav's proposal would effectively provide rules such that the 15 megahertz piece would be rezoned for 5G. That means higher antenna heights, higher power levels, because NextNav's solution and 5G go hand in hand. NextNav provides its positioning, navigation, and timing PNT service over 5G using the PRS waveform.
Real quick, so PNT, explain the technology to our listeners so they understand specifically what they're offering, I guess.
Yeah, well, I should say that I'm not an engineer. I only know this from reading. I'm a generalist. I'm a layperson. But what NextNav's technology does is it uses the 5G waveform and talking to 3 or more towers to determine its location. That's the kind of X and Y axis. They also have a technology called Pinnacle, which is their Z axis, which can tell you how high you are. And both of these has been in service previously, right? They had this in service for years in the Bay Area out in California. And so they know it works. They've shown that it works. And I think they make a very strong case to the FCC that this will work nationwide.
And Cal, I guess just one point on this, maybe just it would help to understand why the 902 to 927 band, this low spectrum band, is so important in this context. Because, I mean, as a layperson, I just think of like, hey, there's all this 5G out there. There's been 4G. There's been spectrum across the country. But, I guess I have a basic understanding that, there's the propagation in urban canyons. There's all of this. So I think it would be helpful to double click that.
Yeah,
on that.
sure. And I realize there's a lot here, so thank you. It's important to kind of unpack. So the role of low band in telecom is for coverage, right? It covers great distances. It penetrates walls very well. And then there's also capacity. So telecom executives talk about kind of like a wedding cake style thing with a larger base and going to narrower levels as you go up. If you look at the recent deal that AT&T just did with EchoStar, right? They were buying a piece of mid-band and a piece of low band. They bought the 600 frequency from EchoStar, which, by the way, was, I believe, a great comp for NextNav. But the 900 spectrum is very interesting to telecom providers, I believe, because of its propagation characteristics and its ability to go through walls and things like that. GPS vulnerabilities are primarily, like you mentioned, in urban canyons and inside of buildings. right? It's a problem with satellite phones too. There's a lot in the news right now about direct to device, things like that. Very hard indoors. And 900 has the benefit of excellent propagation characteristics.
So their technology could be used other areas, but this particular band is where it really is important for all of us. I mean, just as an American, I need this, right? So, and that's why they're. Go ahead. Maybe I'll pause there if you have.
Well, it's also important to say that this band was set aside in the 1990s explicitly for LMS, location monitoring service. So
Got it.
this band for a generation now has been thought of as where location services should be. And it was the intention of the FCC for services to develop in this band. And I think NextNav is the best hope. And so that is sort of the petition, right? NextNav is saying, let us rezone the band for 5G and let us partner with a 5G carrier such that we can provide this service nationwide. And I think it aligns very well with the goals of the current administration and the current FCC chairman, because it checks a lot of boxes, right? It's lighting up more spectrum, providing it for carriers, which has been a goal of Brendan Carr's for a very long time. It also has important national security implications. So that's the petition.
And national security is simply as a backup to GPS. As we've learned, GPS can be jammed. It's if you don't have some type of, if it's a single point of failure, if you don't have a backup system, obviously there are national security implications. So that's that angle, correct?
Yes, and I was going to save this for later in our talk, but just this week, Brendan Carr, FCC Chairman Brendan Carr, gave a talk at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and he highlighted a recent event where the president of the European Commission was flying in a plane in Eastern Europe and was subject to a GPS jamming attack. He brought that up and emphasized that the FCC plans on doing something about this.
Okay.
To me, that's good news, right? Because that potentially means, in my opinion, that the FCC is likely to move forward with NextNav's petition. The other link that is worth checking out, and I hope you'll provide it, and I'll share it with you, is the notice of inquiry. So a little under a year after NextNav made their petition, in March of this year, the FCC put out what's called a notice of inquiry, which is a big document basically asking everyone to share what they can about PNT, and their goal was to, quote, build a record on specific actions the commission can take. And the NOI also asked for comment on NextNav specifically, among other technologies. And I think the NOI docket is really worth a read, because it shows, if you read it carefully and you explore the other technologies, I think it shows that none of the other potential GPS backup systems are ready to go today. They all have various issues, whether it's funding or it's technology. I think if this administration wants to get something done soon, I really think that NextNav is best in class, and it's the most likely move, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So,
and I think
go ahead,
there's been some, recent movement. So, because I'm trying to kind of build the case of understanding, at least in my mind, that you've got this 902 to 928 band. NextNav absolutely is saying they need it. They need it to build all the PNT system that you mentioned, and also the 5G. They've had some, I guess, wins, as maybe you would characterize it as a win. I'm a layperson, so I don't really know, but they've got 3 blocks, as I understand it, A, B, C, and they got this, I guess, anti-aggregation rule waived. Maybe you could describe what happened and why that's such a critical part of the puzzle today.
Yeah, so I think what you're referring to is the acquisition of Telesaurus. So there was an FCC rule that was preventing historically, or it still does, but it's been waived in this case, that prevents too much concentration of ownership in any given band. With NextNav's acquisition of Telesaurus, that put them over the threshold of ownership concentration in the 900 band. They ended up getting that waived, and the FCC allowed them to close. The FCC allowed the assignment of those Telesaurus licenses to NextNav's subsidiary. Everything the FCC does has to be in the public interest, right? This goes back to the Communications Act of 1934. That's their guiding document. And so everything that they do, it has to be justified in the public interest. The public interest argument here that the FCC made was in light of further development expected in the band, they saw that it was in the public interest to allow this concentration of ownership. Now, that's interesting, right? Because what could they be talking about? NextNav at this point is the only licensee in the LMS band. What further development do they mean? Well, I think they mean some form of NextNav's proposal.
That was this summer when that news came out, correct, Calgary?
Yes.
Okay.
Anyway, I feel like we're getting into the weeds pretty thoroughly, and it shows that you guys have done your homework, and I appreciate that. But there's also been some recent news about valuation, right? The implied value of NextNav today is about 80 cents per megahertz pop, based on their current holdings. If you look at the deal that was announced earlier this month by AT&T and EchoStar, or maybe it was at the very end of August, in the last 2 weeks, there was a deal between AT&T and EchoStar. And if you make a few assumptions about what the mid-band is worth, they paid a very full price for that low band, for the 600 spectrum, in excess of $2 per megahertz pop. I think that's a really good sign for NextNav. The 900 is a bit better, but it serves a similar purpose, right? It's about coverage, it's about propagation. So I think that's also been part of the story.
And just to focus in on that, so our listeners can understand where the value is really coming from here. I mean, one might look at this and say, oh, well, they're going to run this technology for the U.S. government, but the real value is actually them selling that spectrum, correct? Once it gets, assuming, I should say, that it gets approved, that their ask is accepted by the FCC without any, major caveats, that they'll be able to then sell that spectrum to a major operator at some number per megahertz pop. And that's kind of giving you the enterprise value, if you will, and then you bridge all the way to the equity and you get kind of your target price. So we thinking about that correctly? Like most of the value is coming from this. I mean, you said it was a technology company with a spectrum asset. Most of the value is coming from the spectrum asset component of this, if I understand the thesis correctly. Color there would be great.
I think that's a fair way to think about the math. There is a value to the GPS service and the technology. It's harder to value. But I also want to be careful here because the company, if you talk to management, they're not saying we're planning on selling the company.
Okay.
It's not 100% clear whether it's one partner or multiple partners or whether it's a sale or a lease or exactly how this is going to be structured. So I don't want to put words into their mouths. Also, they have an active regulatory process. I think ultimately, I think they're going to be successful because it's a win for the taxpayer. It's a win for national security. It's great for the mobile carriers as well. I think ultimately, a lot of people win from this. There are people in opposition. I don't think they really lose as much as they say they're going to. But I do want to be careful about the idea of selling it. But yes, if you're valuing this in a spreadsheet, definitely the way to do it is to look at comparable transactions.
So, well, whether they sell it or whether they don't, it's an asset value play, correct? It's like, look, they're going to have the spectrum. The spectrum is going to be worth some number per megahertz pop, and that's where the bulk of the bull thesis comes from, correct?
Yes, I think at the end of the day, the most likely outcome here is AT&T, Verizon, someone like that will probably enter into a contract with NextNav that validates that value. But remember, the FCC is probably going to impose some conditions on the assignment,
right?
Such that they're certain that the country really gets the GPS backup system that's been promised.
Right. Okay, Donnie, you have anything at the moment on this part of the thesis? I've got a couple places I could go.
Yeah, no, I think it's
your time.
I think it's helpful to characterize. I think the counter arguments, though, appear very strong. I think that's where a lot of people getting deep into the weeds because the counter arguments are deep into the weeds against this in a lot of ways. At least as we understand it. And again, we're outside parties. I don't have a ownership in NextNav, and I don't believe Jeff does either. But
no, I do not.
And so, maybe it's helpful, I think, to just turn this in some sense and think about what are the alternative views here for the other parties that are, I think, taking the other side of this. It'd be helpful to walk through those. And then I think we can end a little bit on the distribution of outcomes. But maybe just help us understand these, because they're pretty strong arguments, at least on the surface, it seems like. I mean, if you go and Google around, that people are taking a position against this. But maybe you could help us unpack those.
We could say.
Sure.
Yeah, controversial is a good way to put it.
And so, and just to frame that, Calgary, if we're thinking about what the stock is worth, right? When you think about, you've got the GPS business, you've got this spectrum asset that has some value potentially that we can argue what the number is. If you then bridge all the way to the equity, you do have some non-equity claims. You have some convertible debt held by MCOR, by Fortress. In your scenario, you're assuming all that debt converts to equity. I don't believe there are any other non-equity claims in the bridge. So basically, you end up with something kind of like 200 million shares outstanding, if that's roughly right. And so we need to figure out what's the value of the GPS, what's the value of the spectrum, anything else that might come along in terms of non-equity claims, in terms of the FCC decision, which we can talk about. And then we kind of bridge to what the equity is worth. That's kind of how I'm thinking about it in my mind anyway. And we can talk about what those other items might be. But maybe at a high level, what are the points that if you had a crystal ball and you wanted to get 100% confidence in the thesis, what are the types of things you want to figure out that maybe there's still some question marks around?
Yeah. I don't know about the crystal ball side of things. There have been short reports, and there's a significant short interest in the stock. So not everyone agrees with me.
That's what
yeah, it's a bit of a battleground stock right now, especially with what I think is a Q4 catalyst. A lot of people want to figure out which way this is going to go. And so look, there have been some very sophisticated sounding counter arguments and bear theses.
Mm-hmm.
And so we should walk through them. I think one of them is that, and probably the most obvious, is that there's a lot of opposition here, right? And there are two main institutional oppositional factions. The first is the toll operators, groups like EasyPass in the New York area. It's the Bridge and Tunnel Authority. It's the International Bridge and Tunnel Authority. But EasyPass is kind of the gorilla in that camp. Now, they say that they don't want to see this happen because they say that they're going to have to retune their transponders and the tags, and it's going to cost them all sorts of money and lost revenues. They've got municipal bonds to think of, on and on.
And this is because of the changes to the spectrum, to the band that NextNav is requesting. These folks are claiming that that's going to screw up their devices, the way their devices operate in the band, and that's hence the opposition.
Yes, and also these are licensed operators, right? So they're entitled to be where they are, to operate where they are, and they are supposed to be entirely free from interference.
Okay.
With that said, EasyPass uses at least 3 different technologies, one of which is not tunable. The other 2 are tunable, which means they can change the frequency that they use to communicate between the cars and the transponders,
right?
The readers. So NextNav has put out some really detailed technical studies on this. NextNav doesn't believe that there's going to be much cost at all to coexistence with the toll operators. NextNav, according to their filings, has spent over a year trying to engage with EasyPass and to embark on joint testing. They've gotten nowhere with that, so NextNav did their own testing. And so of the 3 technical protocols, the non-tunable one doesn't have to move at all. It currently operates within the 11 megahertz that are going to be set aside. The other 2 are mostly in the 11 megahertz where they won't be affected. They do operate somewhat in the piece that NextNav intends to use for their PNT service. However, those 2 systems are tunable. Between that and the kind of normal upgrade cycles that are necessary to maintain those pieces of equipment, NextNav is making the argument that the true financial costs to EasyPass are going to be de minimis. And NextNav has offered a reasonable financial compensation. So I think it is an issue. I think it's able to be solved. The other faction is what the FCC calls Part 15 devices, which I mentioned earlier, are the unlicensed devices. Now, NextNav they have made a lot of noise, and because there are a lot of companies who manufacture these things, so there have been big industry groups. They used to make their filings on the letterhead of the Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber of Commerce no longer lets them use their letterhead, but these guys are on the bottom of the totem pole of priority. They are unlicensed, so they are supposed to accept interference. Now, in this band, however, there's precedent saying that they cannot be made subject to unacceptable interference. So the real question is going to come down to whether or not the interference they're subject to is unacceptable. That's not a defined term. It really is up to the FCC. NextNav has made detailed technical filings showing that they will not be subject to unacceptable interference, and they're not going to be forced to relocate. they're going to continue to operate across the whole band.
In that petition, in NextNav's petition, wasn't that one of the requests that they made, that language gets removed? I thought I remember reading that somewhere.
Yes, it is. They did make a request around that. And that is one of the things that the Part 15 operators have been fighting. But, NextNav has made detailed technical filings and the other side hasn't. And, they continue to claim that they're going to be subject to these big retuning costs and that smart locks won't work and people's household cameras won't work. But I think NextNav has persuasively made the argument that these devices live in a contested environment. In your home alone, there's probably dozens right now, Jeff, and they all have to live with each other's interference. And so they have channel hopping techniques. They have, they're used to interference. In fact, there was an ex parte filing today. I think they're contradicting themselves. It looks like they hire lawyers instead of engineers. We'll see. At some point, the FCC is going to have to split the baby here.
So the question then would become whether or not there's interference that's quote unquote unacceptable to these devices, and what, if any, costs would need to be, borne by NextNav to solve that problem. That's a question mark, I guess. Not one you seem too worried about, but a question.
It is a question mark. Ultimately, it's going to come down to the FCC to make a decision. But so far, I believe NextNav's technical filings have been persuasive. But it'll definitely be something that I believe probably gets handled in the NPRM stage, because just like any of these other procedures, the NPRM is going to be a notice and comment process, where the FCC will put out the NPRM, which is effectively saying, hey, we're thinking about making these rule changes. And then there'll be another comment period. And so this will all be relitigated.
Okay.
And just on that point, I guess, is there precedent here where spectrum has been allocated for X use, the FCC repurposed it for Y use? Is that happened in the past, or is this sort of Terra Nova?
Yeah, I think it has happened in the past. I think this happened with it's happened over and over again as 5G has progressed, right? We saw this with C-band. I don't know the whole history, but there are precedent cases, and I've focused on, well, I'm sure we'll get to it, but like the windfall issues. So when I'm reading back for precedent cases, I'm usually trying to understand the risks of things going wrong. That might be a good transition into the windfall.
Yeah, please. I think that's a top topic. Yeah,
that's a big one.
Yeah,
because
I think go into it, Cal. Yeah, explain what it is and maybe just
explain the issue and then kind of how you're thinking about it.
Yeah. So one of the things that people say is like, well, if there was one short report that I won't name, but they said, well, look at how this is valued on the balance sheet, and that doesn't really matter. Well, I mean, but people will say, all right, the FCC is going to just let you have all this value. That's not really how it works, right? Now, I think that if you go back and look at, I think probably the most important case, a recent case for an anti-windfall penalty was in the case of Straight Path. In the case of Straight Path, there was actually fraud. They were cheating on their build-out requirement tests, and there was a whistleblower, and they were caught cheating, and they ended up entering into a consent agreement with the FCC such that they paid a penalty, and then once their spectrum was sold, they had to pay 20% of the proceeds to the U.S. government. This was a case where there was fraud. They were straight lying to the FCC, and they had to pay 20% of their proceeds to the federal government.
Okay.
That doesn't seem so crazy, and I don't think that breaks this thesis. I mean, my middle of the range valuation for this stock is in the 50s, right? Even if you applied a 20% windfall to the entire thing, you're still getting a stock in the. So first of all, I think a windfall in this case, you can still do well from here. However, NextNav isn't being gifted 15 megahertz of spectrum. NextNav has over 13 megahertz of licensed spectrum that it bought and paid for. It's not a gift in any sense of the word. NextNav is promising to deliver at no cost to taxpayers something of great value, which has been valued at tens of billions of dollars, and importantly, in excess of any spectrum value they're going to receive. So I think when the FCC has to sit down and look at this, they have to decide what's in the public interest. And I think NextNav's public interest argument is really strong. Straight Path didn't have any kind of public interest argument. It's not an issue that I'm overly concerned about. The FCC did ask about windfall issues in the notice, the public notice following NextNav's petition. And honestly, there wasn't a lot of material in the comments about it. It's something we'll have to see. I think NextNav has a lot of good arguments about why a windfall wouldn't be appropriate here. And then again, if it does look like something in the straight path mold, I think it's an event that shareholders could survive and still profit with.
So, in a little bit there on the narrow band that they currently have and the request to basically make it, and I'm no expert here, but like my understanding is they have a bunch of local licenses they want to basically have upgraded to a broadband, national broadband type of license. Obviously, it seems like that would be worth a lot more than a bundle of local licenses. So could one argue that if they grant that obviously makes their current asset worth a lot more, like potentially a lot more. In which case, if the government went a different route, such as like auctioning off that national broadband, that they could raise more revenue for the taxpayer. Is there an argument there that this would be a relatively large giveaway to NextNav that would potentially exceed the value that they're proposing with PNT, especially given that there are other providers potentially that could provide the service without making such a large request? I guess that's kind of my first pushback. And I think, Donnie, maybe you have something there that you want to add or
No, I think that's
but that's not
I think
one
that's
pushback, I guess.
I think that's a fair ask for a question.
Yeah, okay. Just a quick point of information, Jeff. All FCC licenses are local, right? They're all economic area by economic area. I guess what we're talking about is changing the power levels and the antenna heights such that it would be useful for 5G, which does make the spectrum more valuable. There's no doubt about it. However, the idea that this is a giveaway, I think, is not realistic, right? NextNav has made filings that show that even one day of GPS outage would cost the country many billions of dollars. They have an economic report that they've published in the docket that shows the value of a GPS backup system to be $14 billion, I believe. So remember, that is going to be provided to the nation without any cost to taxpayers. So I think if you're kind of weighing the values, that goes a long way. Now, the idea of somehow taking NextNav spectrum and auctioning it off without, compensation to NextNav strikes me as a little silly, right?
Isn't that what they did in 2019 with the C-band, though? Like all those satellite companies, I think they got compensated. I'm not an expert, but I think they got compensated for that.
Yeah.
This was like, is it Telesat, Intelsat, all those companies?
Intelsat
knowledge pretty quickly, but I remember something like that happening, and I guess could that happen again in this case would be a question.
Look, so in that case, first of all, those license holders were non-US companies, right? They were foreign companies. The FCC was trying to open up more spectrum for G, as they always are, and it became a political issue. The president got involved, but I think a big part of it was that, again, these were foreign holders. The government ended up having a public auction instead of a private auction like they intended. But I would point out that those companies still did really well on their investments in spectrum.
Right.
The government did take the lion's share of the proceeds because the valuations had increased a lot. But, that I would say is a very different case because it was purely a financial transaction, right? These companies were just going to sell it and pocket the proceeds. NextNav is not like that. Right? NextNav, their PNT solution and 5G go hand in hand. There's no NextNav without 5G. It uses the 5G waveform to provide its information. And so NextNav needs to be paired with 5G. Also, NextNav bought and paid for its licenses, right? I mean, it would be a taking. Earlier in the summer, it looked like the FCC was potentially going to enforce build-out requirements against EchoStar. And EchoStar, for a moment, looked like it might file for bankruptcy protection in order to protect itself from the FCC. Now, fast forward, the stock has quadrupled, and there's no talk of a windfall. There's no talk of a takings or just taking Charlie Ergen's spectrum and auctioning it off. I mean, the FCC is not going around mugging people. They just want to see spectrum lit up, and they want to see it used in the public interest.
Hey, everyone, and we're going to take a break there. That concludes part 1. Next week, we'll be back with part 2, our interview with Calgary Leveen to discuss NextNav.